Podcast. My name is Stephen Clark, and this week I'm joined by my co-host Nick Ponte, and today's guest is Bill Irvine from Universal Credit Advice. Hello, guys. How are you doing?
Hi there.
Bill, can you start by giving us a quick introduction to what is it you do and a bit on your background?
Yeah, I'll try and keep it short for you. I used to actually work in housing for a good number of years. I was one of the heads of service at South Lanarkshire, where amongst other things we had 40,000 council houses, and I was responsible for the income management, the revenues, the collection of rents and all that type of stuff. And I was also in charge of housing benefit. I was also a local government advisor in Scotland to the Housing Benefit Standing Committee. So I was involved in the guidance, the legislation, etc. for a number of years. I retired from all of that and went back into the private sector from where I originally came for a number of years. And then the company I was involved in, we sold it and did nothing for a couple of years, and then decided to do a wee bit of advice to Scottish Federation of Housing Associations. And then via that, I became involved with SAL. I wrote the LHA response for SAL, the Scottish Association of Landlords, in 2008, and then gave evidence to the inquiry. And then from that, YouTube kicked in, and I started doing a wee bit of advising both housing associations and private landlords. And I've since then built up a website, and also I've got 1,300 registered members, mainly housing associations. About 90% are housing associations and councils, about 10% are private landlords. I'm now retained by the National Residential Landlord Association and give advice to all of their members who are invested in the LHA or Universal Credit.
Superb. What a background, Bill. Thanks for coming on the podcast and sharing your experience with us. It'd be good to have you on.
So thanks very much for coming on the podcast, Bill. It's really good to have you on. I think now a time's as good as any to have you on as a universal credit expert as we negotiate these kind of tough times that people are facing financially. Can we just kind of roll back to basics for our listeners and just give us a little idea? I mean, if you can describe briefly what exactly universal credit is, because I know a lot of landlords are actually still writing in their adverts, no DSS, so people are still stuck in these old times and they might be away the housing benefit, but universal credit's quite a relatively new thing. So can you just talk a little bit about that and how the rollout's going?
Well, universal credit was introduced in 2013, 7 years ago. And originally it was designed to replace what they call the legacy benefits, or the means tested benefits, like job seekers allowance, employment support allowance, tax credits, and in particular housing benefit. And the idea was, over a period of 4 years between 2013 and 2017, anybody who was claiming means tested benefits, where you have to demonstrate you've got capital less than £16,000 and you've got a very limited income or no income at all, the idea was that universal credit was going to replace all of those legacy benefits. So they started the process, but periodically during that 4-year period, the process was stopped and started. And it got quite a lot of bad publicity, as I'm sure you're aware as well. Over the 4-year period, 5-year period, they added probably about 1 million claims. And then in the last 18 months, they added another 1.5 million. And as more and more claims were being added, more and more mistakes were being made, more difficult problems for landlords as well with trying to get their money, which previously was paid by housing benefit and paid directly to the landlord. And one of the features of universal credit was the default was to pay the money to the tenant. And in theory, you could actually see why the government would want to do that. But in practice, we knew already from the LHA scheme in 2008 that between 2008 and 2010, roughly about 20% of all claims that were actually made were in arrears. And that was due to the fact that the money was being paid to the tenant, and the tenant was then misusing that money. So we didn't learn from that experience, or the government didn't learn from that experience. And the same equally applied with universal credit. Originally, the default was, let's pay the tenants. And over the next 2 or 3 years, housing associations in particular were reporting significant rises in the rent arrears. And that, because of the lobby of the housing associations, their MPs, ministers, their MSPs, etc., they were able to influence the creation of this thing called alternative payment arrangements, or APAs as it's commonly known, that allows the payment to be made to the landlord, the private landlord included. But the social landlords are actually treated more favourably than the private landlords, because they have a private, what they call portal, and more or less guarantees payment to the housing associations if they apply to get the money redirected to them. The private landlords, on the other hand, they had to apply using what they call UC47s, an application form to get that money redirected. And that's just not worked at all well. Thankfully, in the last week, they've actually replaced UC47s with a new online version.
Yeah, I want to get onto that a bit later, if you don't mind, Bill. But
okay.
Just before we kind of get onto that, so can I just ask you, Universal Credit, is that now totally overtaken the old housing benefit? Because I think I've got a few tenants that are still on the housing benefit. Could that be right? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, what they planned to do was to phase the transfer or the migration, as they call it, over that 4-year period, but it's taken much longer than that. So you'll still have people on housing benefit and continue to be on housing benefit where they have no change in their circumstances. So if they stay in the same house and there's no change within the household, they don't become unemployed, they don't all of a sudden become sick, having been unemployed, etc., then they'll stay on housing benefit. But as soon as they have a change in circumstances, that will promote a claim for universal credit. The other thing was that the migration process was too slow for DWP at one point. So because of that, they were actually saying to people, I think you should now claim universal credit. They had no need to claim, but they were actually encouraged to claim. And in the course of doing that, many of them actually transferred over losing money. So there will be still a proportion of people claiming housing benefit. The pensioners, anybody over 66, if they're single, or if there's a couple where both of them are over that age, they'll continue to claim housing benefit. If you're in what they call very sheltered accommodation, they'll continue to claim housing benefit. But for working age people under the age of pension, then they'll be expected at some point over the next 2 or 3 years to claim universal credit. The idea is that by 2024, anybody of working age, if they're looking for help with housing costs, will have to claim universal credit.
Okay, that's great. And obviously, there was a lot of bad press right at the start, from loads of different problems, from tenants were reporting that they weren't getting their benefits through, and then landlords reporting that they weren't getting their rent paid. So what would be the most common problems then that has been with this new system effectively?
Well, I mean, the biggest problem initially was the 5-week wait for the first payment. Because when you make a claim, if you make a claim today, the 20th of May, the way it works is they calculate it from the 20th of May to the 19th of June, and they pay you 7 days later. So you would then get paid around about the 26th of June. That was the theory, but way back at the start, it was taking much longer than that to actually receive payment. And especially if you were a landlord, because the landlord had to wait all that bit longer before they get paid. And that included the housing associations and the councils as well. They were waiting sometimes 10 and 12 weeks for that first payment. So not surprisingly, the rent arrears started to rise quite dramatically at that point. So that was one of the biggest issues. From a landlord's point of view, one of the biggest issues is the lack of communication. They don't really treat a landlord as their client. Landlords are actually not even mentioned in the complaints procedures. In terms of housing benefit, landlords had rights. They could actually take their case if it was an overpayment or the request for the money to be paid directly. If that was refused by the council, then they could actually take that case to a tribunal, and they could actually present their case and the tribunal could find in their favour. With universal credit, those things, those rights to take to an independent tribunal were taken out of the appellate process. So nowadays, under universal credit, landlords are relying on a discretionary scheme. And this is this thing I was mentioning earlier on called alternative payment arrangements.
Right, just on that communication, right? Say, for example, I'm a landlord and I've managed to advertise my property and I've got a tenant potentially interested who's going to be a universal claimant. What have you got any tips to manage the kind of engagement between that tenant right from the start so that a landlord can stand the best possible chance of getting obviously the housing payments coming through the tenant. I mean, I know they set up Universal Credit really to give the tenant the power of managing their own money, but is there anything a landlord could do right at the start of a tenancy which could help the whole process?
Yeah, the most effective way is for the landlord to take as much control right from the very start as possible. My daughter does this on behalf of quite a lot of my landlord clients. She does what I call the front end stuff. So when they select who the best person is for the house that's been advertised, because every claim is different. You know, you could be a single person, you could be a couple, you could be a single parent, you could have disabilities, and all of these claims are dealt with differently. So the first thing is, if you've got a good knowledge of the system, then you make sure your claim is put in early, because if you delay putting in the claim, there's not the same ability to get it backdated as you would with housing benefit. The other thing is, it's an online claim, and in many ways it's easier to claim than housing benefit because it is online. But the more you know about it, the more likely you'll not lose out. Once you actually make the claim, what we do is we try whatever we can to get the money paid to the landlord. So you need to understand the grounds on which you can do that. If problems are discovered early on as well, then they can be tackled. And what we try to do is get to the person nearest to the claimant. So there are people called work coaches and case managers. And if you can get to these individuals, the likelihood is you'll solve the problem much better and much quicker than
These
if
are
you
people.
do
These are people that work for the job centre, DWP.
for the DWP. Yeah, if you can get the ones closest to the claimant, because every claimant who makes a claim for Universal Credit, they have a work coach and an account manager. And when they make the claim, they have to be interviewed and they have to make a commitment to look for work or more work in some cases if they're already employed. And these are the people that they communicate with. And these work coaches can actually trigger the payment straight to the landlord from day one if they believe that it would be in the best interest of the tenant to actually make that payment. So the more you know about the system, the more likely you will mitigate any potential losses. If you're a landlord who takes the view, well, I'll leave it to my tenant, then the likelihood is you will lose money and very quickly start to lose money.
But let's just kind of go over this, because ultimately my understanding is that it's the tenant that holds all the cards here right at the start. They have to agree to everything, right? Because effectively it's up to them to instigate the application and then agree to all the other decisions later down the line. Is that right?
No, it's up to the claimant to make the claim. There's no doubts about that. And it's in their interest to make the claim. The difference between this and housing benefit is they're not only claiming for the housing costs, they're actually claiming for the money they use to pay their bills as well, the heating bills, the food and all that. So there is an incentive for them to make the claim. If you've got somebody who's able-bodied and can do that themselves, the online process is dead simple, right? Where it becomes more difficult is where you've got somebody who's maybe got some learning difficulties, who needs somebody to help them with the claim. Again, going back to what I was saying about my daughter, she actually helps people through this process. Now you need to get their consent, if that's what you're referring to, Nick.
Consent, and I've watched your videos on your website, Universal Credit Advice, and they're really helpful. And from as far as I can see, it's quite a straightforward. They've tried to make it as easy as possible, right? It looks quite straightforward.
Yeah, I mean, when they started doing this, they actually engaged with down in Croydon, one of my big clients down there, a big private landlord client, and also with the local council. So when they developed the actual questionnaire that you use to make the claim, many of the housing staff down there who previously had real big doubts about the actual claiming process were completely convinced that it was easier to claim than housing benefit. Where it falls down is in the payment side. From a landlord's point of view, that's the bit that they're really interested in. Yeah. And that's the bit that originally wasn't working.
Well, let's talk about that then, because this is the biggest question that landlords want to know. How do we get the payments paid directly to the landlord? And you touched on it earlier on with this APA.
Yeah, I mean, from last week, what they've done is they've actually created an online version now. So you can go online and you can actually make your claim. And some of my clients have actually been piloting this for the last 12 months to 18 months. And it's completely transformed the success rate of APAs. Prior to that, they were losing.
What does APA stand for? Sorry, what?
Alternative payment arrangements. Some landlords still call them direct payments. doesn't matter what you call them. That the technical name is alternative payment arrangements, abbreviated to APAs, and that they had these forms called UC47s. And if you were a landlord applying, you had to send some of them by email, but you couldn't put an attachment with them other than the UC47. If you put any other attachments, they just simply deleted it because they felt it was coming from an unsecure email address. Now, under housing benefit, I've been emailing housing benefit for the last 20 years through emails with attachments, but no problem. But DWP were super sensitive to this. They were also, way back at the start, saying that the tenant had to give explicit consent for the money to be transferred to the landlord, even if they were in rent arrears and even if they had misused the money the previous month and the previous maybe 2 or 3 months. And we, because of the complaints we made to the independent case examiner, they then withdrew that. So from 2017, explicit consent no longer applies, so they don't need to get consent from the tenant. In April 2018, they said, if somebody's on LHA and the money's paid to the landlord and the circumstances that led to that are still existing, then the payment can actually be made from the day one under Universal Credit to the landlord as well. I know about that, and some of my clients know about that because I continually am updating them on things, but the vast majority of landlords don't know about that. So therefore, when they do it, they just have to wait until the person's got 2 months rent arrears. And that's where most of the damage is caused. Once they get that 2 months or more rent arrears, it takes all that longer to get that money back. In some cases, very difficult to get it back.
That's some really good value there that you've shared, Bill. Thanks very much. So from what I can gather from that is there are ways of kind of mitigating the risk, basically, of renting to tenants with that are Universal Credit claimants. Let's talk a little bit about the current situation that we're now faced. And obviously, people are facing slightly higher rent arrears across the board. And, now we need to know about these things, Universal Credit. Landlords need to know, possibly landlords that have never rented to Universal Credit claimants are now finding themselves in a position where, this is all new to them. So obviously the current situation moving forward, there's going to be a lot more claims, like you said, and people need to educate themselves.
Yeah, I mean, you've went from 2.5 million claims to 4.2 million in a matter of a month. So you're absolutely right. There's a lot of landlords who've said on the various blogs and things like that they would never take someone who was unemployed, and they're now beginning to realise that it's not really choice. Sometimes your landlord, because of the changes that have kicked in recently, are having to claim Universal Credit or are furloughed and they're having to live with less money. And many of these people, self-employed as well, are actually turning to Universal Credit. And I don't give much plaudits to DWP, but in this instance, they actually progressed about 1.5 million new claims within a matter of 4 weeks, and were able to get important payments out to these people who would otherwise have had nothing in some cases or very little. But over the next 2 or 3 years, the unemployment rate is not going to reduce. If anything, it's going to increase, and that's not just in the UK. It's all over, probably Europe at the very least. In America, it's even worse at the moment. So it's not going to be a short-term issue. This is going to be a long-term thing.
And I've got to say, I've got a couple of tenants who are previously working and have found themselves in situations where they haven't been furloughed, and that was their only option to go down Universal Credit. And I have been actually really impressed about the speed and the efficiency. So, do we give credit there to the Department of Work and Pensions for actually getting a system in place where they're able to cope with this workload? I think we do need to give them some credit.
Absolutely, and over the last month, what they've done is redeployed 10,000 staff from other duties to actually make sure these claims were progressed, and the payments they've actually made amount to millions of pounds. And for probably the next 2 or 3 years, that's going to be the very same. If anything, the number of claims are going to increase as jobs are closed down through redundancy or whatever.
Yeah, exactly. And I've never really bought into this whole idea of, don't touch housing benefit or don't touch Universal Credit claimants. I've got probably about, before COVID, I had about out of 89, 90 properties, I had about 6 or 7 who were benefit claimants. And I've got to say, all of them were absolutely brilliant rent payers, and they were all in charge of their own finances. So I think, maybe I've just been lucky, but I just think we can't tar them all with the same brush. And I hate this mentality of, them against us sort of thing.
Yeah, I've got clients that have built their business on the back of LHA or Universal Credit, and 80%, 75-80% of the tenants who get the money hand it over. That's been the case since 2008 when LHA was brought in. It's this rump of 20 or 25% where the problem arises. And those could easily be remedied by the DWP paying the money to the landlord, because that's what it was designed to be paid for in the first place. It's there to extinguish the rent liability or reduce the rent liability. And if you give money to somebody who the previous months misused it on other things rather than the rent, they're actually putting themselves and their family at risk of eviction. And that was what the APA scheme, or the alternative payment scheme, was designed to avoid. So a lot of these people who have been long-term unemployed are actually good tenants. They're given a bad name in many cases, and people are just, as you say, tarring everybody with the one brush, when in fact many of them are good long-term tenants.
Yeah, private landlords recently, they've been the most stable tenants because everyone's been affected by COVID-19. So the ones that have been long-term employed, they're still paying their rent as normal through their benefit scheme that they were on. So they're pushing the pudding for that. Yeah,
I think the majority are. There are a few who have picked up, this idea that landlords are getting a 3 months holiday, when in fact, obviously they're not getting a 3 months holiday. The money still had to be paid at some point. But in many cases, these tenants have recognised that they still need to pay their rent. In some cases, what the landlords are doing is engaging with them and saying, well, look, I realise maybe you can't pay the full amount, but if what we can do is come to an arrangement so that when this crisis is over, any debt that you've accrued, we can then recover over a month or a repayment scheme over the next few months. And if you're being reasonable about it, and they're being reasonable about it, you can avoid the threat of repossession. One of the big issues that's coming in, as I'm sure you're aware, is this thing called pre-action protocols, particularly south of the border. In Scotland, we call them pre-action requirements. And they've been around for a good number of years, and the social landlords have been applying them. It's really just good practice. It's about engaging with your tenant right at the start if there is any problems. And my experience has been ahead of housing with 40,000 tenants, many of whom actually fell into rent arrears at some point or other. The best way to deal with them is not to take them to court, it's to actually engage with them and come to an arrangement that suits you both, because that is the best way to get your money. And to actually pass your debts to sheriff officers or bailiffs, all it tends to do is add to the debt itself because of the cost that they impose, and it results usually in the person at some point being evicted, and you've got a void period as well. All of that is bad news.
Yeah, and obviously the Scottish Government have just passed a bill basically saying that, if your tenant falls into rent arrears during this, then, you've got to wait 6 months until you apply to the tribunal for an eviction. And with the backlog, possibly, definitely there's going to be a backlog, then you could be talking up to a year. So like you say, much more better to engage with the tenant, see if you can help along the way in that process, definitely.
I think landlords need to appreciate this pre-action protocols or requirements. It's something that the courts treat seriously. And if you have not seemed to be engaging and actually doing what we've just mentioned there, and you take the view, well, as far as I'm concerned, the contractual rent is what I'm due, and I'm going to pursue that. And if need be, take them to court. If you go to court without having engaged with your tenants, the likelihood is the court's going to take an adverse view. Whereas if you can demonstrate you've engaged with the tenant, you've tried to help them with the claim for universal credit or housing benefit, and you come to an arrangement with them, if they renege on it, but you've recorded all of that, then you can then present that to the court. In my experience, the courts take a much more positive approach to that.
Yeah, definitely. I think landlords, are notorious for complaining a lot, and I hate to see landlords coming on forums and playing the victim, because at the end of the day, you get involved in property and, investing in property, there is a risk. I think that we're so lucky in this country to have the benefit system that we do. And I think that a lot of people are going to be looking at this moving forward and think this is a possible, good strategy to actually target housing in areas which, are slightly more deprived, where they are going to be targeting, these sorts of tenants. I think there will be a lot of people interested in this sector now.
I think whether you do that voluntarily or not, you're going to have some parts of the UK that are going to be worse hit than others. If you look at the north of England just now, northwest of England, up in the kind of Liverpools, Lancaster, areas like that, they've been really, really badly hit with unemployment and with the number of people who are claiming benefits, etc. Much more so than other parts like the southeast of England. So in these cases, these areas, I think you'll find that more of the landlords will be forced to say to their tenants, look, you really need to really think about claiming universal credit or housing benefit to make sure that you've got some money to pay towards your rent. And that's going to happen more and more, I think, over the next 2 or 3 years.
Excellent. See, obviously, you've seen a lot in your time, Bill. You've got a lot of experience here. You've probably seen some pretty bad situations where landlords have got themselves into bad rent arrears, etc. Can you give us any, without obviously mentioning any names or anything like that, of any cases, can you give us a kind of idea of a case study, a real life case study, and how you were able to help, or actions that could be taken to possibly avoid it in future? Just, is there anything that kind of jumps out that you can
one of the reasons why I get involved usually is because a landlord has got problems. Sometimes it's with an individual case, maybe an overpayment, where some of my clients come to me with overpayments. One was as high as £76,000 and I got that written off. Recently, £45,000 and I got that written off, if you know what you're doing. In terms of rent arrears, a lot of the rent arrears is caused by things like the overall benefits cap. Now, if you're living in London, for example, or living in any of the big cities where the benefits cap is a feature, then in many cases what's happened in the last few weeks with the LHA rate being raised to the 30 percentile, in many of these cases the extra money paid to the landlord is actually reducing the amount of money that's paid to the individual tenant. They're actually using their own maintenance money to actually pay the rent. If they're getting the money paid directly to them, then they're having the money capped by the benefits cap, and that is causing rent arrears. Now, what you can do in those cases is look to see, first of all, should there be an overall benefits cap? Because there are certain people who can get exemption from that. For example, people on DLA or people on PIP, people who are working a certain number of hours and earning a certain amount of money. In one of the cases that I get involved in, where the landlord was actually losing 5 figures every month in rent arrears, the first thing we did was we looked at that and we reduced substantially the amount of the losses, just simply by getting people exemption from something they should have got exemption from automatically. The other thing is doing the type of thing I was saying earlier on, where as soon as something goes wrong, you're quick to act on it. Rather than allowing it to fester, you get in there and you deal with the issue. And we have like first stage complaints, second stage complaints, plus as well, I've been doing this, as you say, for quite a number of years. So a lot of these people who are senior members of the DWP nowadays, I've actually known and actually trained, would you believe, as well, some of their directorate. So with that type of contact as well, if you can develop those like you do with some of the council's housing benefit teams, that can bring you an early solution. But probably the biggest case was the one in London, where we were saving them tens of thousands of pounds every month just by bringing in a number of these strategies to reduce their debt.
That's interesting. I think what I'm taking from this conversation really is, if you have a tenant that starts experiencing problems and rent arrears do start building up, then certainly not to let it fester. You've got to be proactive as a landlord. Your letting agent, if you use one, make sure you're putting the pressure onto them to make sure they get this sorted out. Because from my experience, it's very difficult to, once a tenant starts slipping into that path of arrears, it's very, very difficult to get them out of that in a lot of cases.
Well, years ago, I got involved in it was actually referred to me, a landlord was referred to me by Paul Champini, from Landlord Action. And the landlord was involved with the rent guarantee scheme, where if you were in rent arrears, the insurance kicked in, and DAS was the insurer. And I get involved in a number of these cases where they had to pay out the insurance. And by getting into the cases, I was able to retrieve a lot of the housing benefit that previously had not been paid. And a lot of these cases that are being pursued by the likes of, the debt collectors and things like that, many of them are pursuing the debt rather than looking at what caused that debt. If you look at the cause of the debt and you have a knowledge of housing benefit or universal credit, invariably you can actually get things sorted. Not in every case, but in some cases you can. So therefore you avoid the need to then take it to court, because taking it to court, in my experience, costs a lot of money in many cases, particularly if the person defends that. And in some areas, it could take a year at the very least to get that person out. If you've served them with a notice or you've had a fallout with them, the likelihood is you're not going to get anything, including your property back, for at least 12 months.
Okay. I'll just start that question again, Bill.
Yeah, okay.
So obviously we are where we are with Universal Credit. We're not going back to the old housing benefit system. Personally, how do you feel about the future Universal Credit? Are you quite kind of positive of the future? I mean, personally, I think that what you've described there about online applications for direct payments, etc., that sounds quite positive. What's your own view?
Yeah, I think the system is actually geared to be better than the other systems because it brings together the maintenance and the housing costs, an online claim. If this COVID crisis had involved both the landlord claiming or the tenant claiming housing benefit and UC separately, it would have been a lot more difficult to actually make the payments. So if things can continue to improve, things like APA's communication with the landlords, particularly the private landlords, where they actually say, we can talk to you, we can share information without breaching data protection. They can actually tell them, we'll pay you with X amount from a date, just like they do with housing benefit. If they can start to release some of that information, and they can actually pay them as well when they're expecting to be paid every 4 weeks or every 5 weeks, depending on the system they're using. And they also allow the landlords in some cases to assist the tenant without all the different obstacles that up until now have been placed in their path. They could actually make the system a much more effective system, and it would actually work for DWP as well, because a lot of the time landlords are particularly frustrated by just all of the obstacles that are sometimes put in their path. They're trying to provide information like, for example, rent statements or a tenancy agreement. Now, the legislation actually allows the landlord to actually provide that information. In some cases, in fact, they're actually obliged. For example, a rent increase in April, if that goes up, they're obliged to notify the DWP of that. And DWP should act on that. DWP are currently saying, no, we won't act on that. We'll only act on the information the tenant puts on his online journal. Now, that's them acting illegally in that case. It'd be far better if they just took the information from the landlord. And in some cases, they do. I've got clients where they actually go into the DWP office with the tenant, and they make the claim and they make the payment to the landlord without any even application. So there are examples of good practice out there, but they just need to look at those and then build them into the system. And if they do, the scheme could actually be a lot better, not only for the tenant, but also for the landlords as well.
Would you say it's harder to get, like you were talking about the people who work at the DWP and these like case officers that are dealing with tenants and that? Like I'm quite new to the lettings game, but I have heard that before it was quite easy to call up the council, the local authority, to try and get stuff sorted out. Would you say it's harder now to get problems sorted out with the direct contact with people?
That's probably the biggest frustration of all, is that within a council setting, you've got a structure there, and you've got the chief executive and you've got the directors. And if things are not going the way the landlord wants, you can escalate it. And these organisations, the councils, treat those seriously. And if I know that if I write to a chief executive, then invariably I'll get a response to my complaint within a week, at the very most, of doing that. But within DWP, in some cases, I'll write to the Director General, Neil Cowling. And way back at the start when we were doing that, it was actually working the way it would work with the council. But I think what happened was the numbers were so many people complaining, they were just swamped. So what they've also done is, apart from this COVID crisis, they've tried to reduce the numbers of staff. They've tried to reduce the access locally as well. They're now doing things through service centres. And they create these phone numbers, the 0800 numbers, the idea being the landlord can phone. But no landlord wants to wait 2 or 3 hours to get through on a phone and then being told, oh, by the way, you can only ask one question. After that, you'll need to put the phone down and ask your second question by going through the same process again. Now that's the type of thing we really need to avoid.
Yeah. Listen, I think that's been brilliant, Bill, and like I'm a total geek about this sort of stuff. I know Stephen's kind of like falling asleep there in the background, but
I've learned loads. This has been a huge school day for me, but I know you're like a dog on heat here. That's been brilliant for you. But I've learned loads.
I mean, I absolutely love this sort of stuff, you know, and so much that I'm learning, and especially from your own self as well, Bill, just listening to some of your YouTube content. You've been interviewed by other channels as well. So I would urge anybody to go and check out Bill's website, Universal Credit Advice, and check out his other interviews on YouTube as well. But before we end this interview, Bill, we've got a couple of questions for you from some of our listeners, because we've got a Facebook group, and actually put an announcement on the group yesterday to say we were going to have you on, and I think you're quite well known to quite a few people. They were like, oh, Bill will be great value, and they've actually asked a few questions. Would you mind just answering? I mean, there's only 2 or 3.
Okay, that's fine. I'll do that. Can I say pass if I can't answer?
Yeah. No, absolutely.
Ask one of our friend, don't ask me.
And some of them are, right, okay, let me just see if I can bring this up. Okay, so the first question's from Barry Gray, and he said, hi Nick, I have a query. Now listen to this one, Bill, because there's dates and things involved here. I think you touched on it earlier. He says, if a tenant moves in on the 10th of the month and their UC rent payment date is the 10th, if, for example, the 6 months later the tenant moves out on the 9th of the month, what happens to the rent payment for period the 10th of previous month to move out date? So there's 30 days of rent due. I think this problem causes because the payments, Universal Credit payments, are paid in arrears, aren't they? So they're not paid up front. So I think this situation can occur possibly at the end of a tenancy. Could you just speak a little bit about that?
Yeah, it's a great question. And it's something that I've covered quite a lot on. And in fact, I alerted landlords to the problem way back probably 3 or 4 years ago. When you claim Universal Credit, they have what they call the benefit assessment period. And using the example that I was using earlier on, if you claim today, which is the 20th of May, your claim is assessed from the 20th of May to the 19th of June, and you're then paid 7 days later. But if, let's say, before the 19th of June, you vacate that property on the 18th, let's say, or the 19th or the 17th, the housing costs are not paid at all for that period. So if somebody's like your tenant, Nick, and they move into a property owned by Steve, using that example there, and they move into Steve's property on the 18th, let's say, of June, then they will actually be paid the rent at Stephen's address rather than yours. And it's then left to you and the tenant to try and resolve that issue.
Right,
now,
okay.
Stephen's going to be happy about it because the likelihood is he's more likely to get his rent. You're not going to be happy. But it can also work the opposite way as well. You using exactly the same example, if you know that Bill Irvine's benefit runs from the 20th to the 19th and he comes to see you about a tenancy and you give him it on the 17th, let's say, he's paid the rent at your address for the whole of that month. So that means that you have got a better chance of getting your payment for that month.
Yeah,
it's all designed for the computer. So when you're thinking of somebody giving notice to you, leaving, you also need to know about this benefit assessment period, because if you know that, you can actually save yourself from losing a month's rent. If you work out that the tenancy should end on, let's say, the 20th of the following month, which would be July, you'll save yourself a month's rent by doing that. So it's a great question, and one that I've been highlighting quite a lot. All the changes of circumstances I've dealt with using that same principle.
Okay, so what I've done in the past, Bill, is I have taken a month's rent and a deposit up front from the tenant. Now, the problem with that, obviously, is you're wiping out a whole audience because a lot of people just don't have that money. But obviously, I've done that in the past, and that provides some security until the benefit kicks in. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, well, the actually DWP, when I raised this with them way back a few years ago, what happened was it was a person who died. So this, in the case of a couple, let's say, using exactly the same period, 20th to the 19th, if one of the couple dies, then they pay the benefit as normal for that month. But if the person is on his own, let's say, and he dies on the wrong day of the month, then it's cancelled completely. Now, the landlord's view is, well, he's lived in the property up until, the last day of his benefit assessment period. At least I should get the date of the payment up to that point in time. But the way it works is they say, no, you don't get anything at all. So the landlord's provided the accommodation and received nothing. DWP's attitude was exactly what you've just said there. The tenancy agreement says you pay in advance. So if he's paid in advance and he dies at the wrong time, that money you got in advance can offset your potential loss. That was their attitude to it. So, and I've raised it, and I actually highlighted one of the newspapers as well, thinking that they would run with it as a news story. But they weren't interested at all in it.
Right, okay. I think you've got more chance now of getting stuff out. I mean, your Twitter's quite good. I mean, putting stuff on Twitter's can create quite a bit of,
Oh, yeah. Well, the director at DWP follow me on Twitter. Yeah. And I've had a few engagements with their director general. Yeah. To be fair to the guy, he's actually tries to be very helpful. Yeah. But I've taken him to task on a number of issues.
Good stuff. Moving on to another question, if you don't mind. This one is from Ella Rad, who's a listener of the show, and she said, hang on a second till I get this up. So she said, why do they make it so difficult to work with tenants on Universal Credit? ? She then goes on to explain, I had a tenant recently that his payment just stopped. We were paid directly, didn't tell us why, then wrote to them and they said because he is in arrears, we can apply again to be paid direct. They rejected our application, again, didn't mention why, and every time mentioned it is a breach of GDPR, they tell us the reason. Then my tenant authorised it in his journal again, and now we are being approved to be paid direct. There is a missing link, she's saying, and she reckons that, as an ICO registered landlord, she should be able to speak to the Universal Credit direct, and this GDPR excuse is nonsense. She's saying that they've cost us 3 months' rent, which the tenant is in arrears, and basically the tenant has lost a loved one and is vulnerable, and we still don't know why his payment has been stopped for the 3 month period. So it sounds like she's been head up against a brick wall there, sort of thing, and then to try and get this sorted. Does that kind of ring any bells? Or
yeah, I mean, again, it's another good question, a good point. This happens all the time. One of the things about the UC47s I was talking about earlier on, sometimes landlords would wait 2 or 3 months before they got their first payment. They would get it and they would think to themselves, well, at least that means I'm not going to lose any money. So they get it for a few months, and then all of a sudden the money doesn't come in. And they contact the tenant who says, I don't know anything about it, because as far as I'm concerned, the money should be paid to you. And what's happened in some of these cases is the tenant has went to the DWP and said to them, see that money you're paying to my landlord, you should now pay it to me, because I no longer have rent arrears. Now, before they do that, what they should do is contact the landlord and say, is that the case? But they're not doing that. Now, that's a pretty straightforward thing to do. And under housing benefit, they're actually obliged to do that. That's part of the process. Who wrote the process? The DWP. So if that process applies to housing benefit, why did it not apply to Universal Credit? If somebody has a change in circumstances and their claim is suspended, housing benefit, they notify you. So you go to the tenant and say, what's happening? Well, they've asked me some information, and you provide it. The claim is restored. The money's paid to the landlord. But DWP takes the view, we can't tell the landlord anything. Now, the landlord's not looking for anything secret. Yeah. All they're looking to do is say, look, we've had to cancel the Universal Credit because we need some information from your tenant. There's no breach of GDPR there, as far as I'm concerned, because the landlord is already getting paid the money. So it's duty bound to be notified that that's going to be brought to an end.
Right. So just to clarify there, if the tenant asks for the money to start getting paid back to their account, then the landlord receives no notification.
That's what's been happening, and that's what I wrote to them just last week about a classic case of that, where for the third time this had happened. The APA was put in, it was then cancelled, the money was paid to the tenant, he got the money and misused it, they got it restored again, and then the same thing happened again about a year down the line. So it's been a very, very frustrating thing for landlords. And the person's asking the question is absolutely spot on. There is no reason for them not to engage with landlords, because the landlord is there to help the tenant and also help the DWP. They're not looking to be told, oh, Mr. Irvine has got income support, or he's got job seekers allowance, or he's got part-time earnings of X amount. There's no need for any of that. Just the basics that they've been able to provide under housing benefit for the last 30 odd years. That's what the landlord's looking for there.
Yeah, okay, that's brilliant. And moving on, Barry Gray's asked again, is there a landlord UC portal in the pipeline? Don't know if that means anything to you.
Yeah, well, they call it different things, but I think what he means is the online application for to get the payments direct. Under housing benefit, again, landlords would be registered users of the portal, and they could go in using their registration number, and they could actually see whether the claim was live and things like that. So DWP has just last week launched this, what they call a portal, but it's very much limited at this point in time. But as time goes on, I think what they will do is build it up so that the landlord will be able to get similar access to what they get under housing benefit, because the portals under housing benefit were actually promoted by DWP. So it's the same organisation. It's that a lot of folk don't realise that housing benefit administered by councils is actually guided by the Department of Works and Pensions. They produce a guidance manual, and the councils act on it. If they just took that guidance manual and applied it to Universal Credit, they could do themselves and the landlords and the tenants a lot of favours.
Yeah, absolutely. And the last question, Bill, is from Neil Robb. He's asked, can you get Bill to explain overpayments? And it should be the person who misleads, not the landlord. And then he's gone on to say, Bill has helped many landlords fight and win against UC, including getting direct payment, and in some cases money that should have been paid but kept going to tenants. Then they claim it back from the tenant who was keeping the rent. Is there anything about overpayments you can touch on quickly?
Yeah, I dealt with one just a few weeks ago there. It was a £15,000 demand that one of my clients got. He wasn't a client at the time. He contacted me and said, look, I've got this £15,000 demand. It was a tenant he had where they had a bit of a fallout. And the tenant actually had got himself another tenancy. He hadn't told this landlord client of mine that he'd got the tenancy. So he was using both properties for quite a while. And what happened was, after he left, about a year after he left, DWP hit him with a £15,000 overpayment demand, saying, your tenant moved out of your property into another property 18 months ago. You should have picked up on that. But DWP didn't realise that the guy was still using the original tenancy. And this is quite a common thing. It might not be to your listeners, but I deal with them on a regular basis. And in this particular case, I wrote to DWP and said to them, look, it was up to the individual to notify you of the change in his circumstances. The fact that he moved into this new tenancy is something that he was obliged to report. The fact he failed to do that, that was the thing that caused the overpayment. So you shouldn't be pursuing my client for it. And Neil was actually right. I remember dealing with Neil in the past. These are the things that come up time and time again. Under housing benefit, some of the overpayments I've been dealing with, I mentioned earlier on one, £76,000. I got that quashed, and that case is still ongoing, would you believe? 5 years. We're now trying to get the back date of housing benefit, which is about £30,000 in that case for the landlord. So these are the type of things that I do, because I used to be a welfare rights advocate in my youth. Never told you about my delinquent past. But I take things to the first and the upper tier tribunals, so that when things go wrong, I'm not able, if I can't mediate and get the thing resolved, which is mostly the case, I then take the thing to either the first or the upper tier tribunals. And overpayments under UC are going to be a big, big issue, because everyone that I deal with, the letters are exactly the same. your client, your tenant's been overpaid, and we want you to pay the money because you should have known about it. But in fact, the likelihood is there was no knowledge on the part of the landlord. But it's easy to get the money back from the landlord and more difficult to get it back from the tenant.
Yeah, exactly. Well, thank you so much, Bill, for your time. I think this has been absolute gold here. I think our listeners will get a huge amount of value from it. And would you like to add anything? Where can people find you if they've got problems with their Universal Credit? Let us know.
Well, if you Google and just put in Bill Irvine or Universal Credit Advice, then they'll get to my website, first of all. There's a lot of information on that. I'm also retained by the Residential Landlords Association, so you'll find loads of articles that I've written on that. If you're a member with the National Residential Landlords Association, you can also access me for a bit of advice because they retain me. But I'm also doing Zoom sessions every day. I do a Zoom session, usually for maybe small landlords, maybe 2 or 3 staff, and we go through the basics sometimes, or sometimes the more complex, depending on the level of knowledge the landlord has. And these sessions, which I'd never thought of using before, have probably been better than anything I've done, because I used to go down to London at least twice a month on a train for 4 or 5 hours, stay overnight, and that was a cost to the landlord. Doing it this way, I can sit in my room in the house, spend an hour, and it's a Q&A. It's everything I do is very informal. It's a Q&A type session, so you're not listening to me for 55 minutes and then I'll say to you, you can ask me some questions now. I prefer to engage right from the start. So those sessions are actually going down very well. But you can become a member of the website as well, and I send out regular bulletins, usually one every couple of weeks at the very least, sometimes 5 or 6 a month. And that is updating the landlords, and it gives good practice things and case studies and things like that. So
that's excellent, Bill. Well, I'd like to thank you again, and hope all our listeners get great value from that. And we'll see you next week for another episode of the Scottish Property Podcast. Bye for now.